just wanna talk about some books. Hey, I just wanna talk about some books. Talk about some books. Talk about some books. Hey, I just wanna talk about some books with you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jo.
And I'm JoJo.
And we're just two Joes reading books.
Just reading books.
Two average Joes reading books.
Today on the podcast, we're going to be talking about the first Dragonriders of Pern book, Dragonflight. But since this is both our first book, we just want to talk a little bit about what this podcast is going to be and why we are picking the books that we're going to be picking for the next couple of months.
So Jo and I, we constantly will be complaining about books to each other or telling each other, you have to read this book. It's an amazing book. And we never can get the timing right so that we're both reading the books at the same time. So we were hoping that this podcast would both allow us and also force us to read these books at the same time so that we can talk about them in a more, for lack of a better word, time-conscious way. So the theme that we have chosen for our first season is dragon books. And we have a few rules that we're following. Rule number 1 is that all of the dragons in the books that we have chosen have to be real dragons. They have to be the animal. They can't be a person who has the title dragon. So the Wheel of Time books has a character who has the title of dragon, but he is a human. So that doesn't count. The same with Uprooted by Naomi Novik. There is a wizard who has the title dragon, but he is just a person. So we're not going to be reading that book. The second rule that we have decided on is there have to be dragons in the first book if the book is a series. And the third rule is that there have to be dragons at least by the middle of the book on screen, on the page, in the book. They can't just be in the end. So books like The Hobbit, Smaug is the shadow throughout the whole book, but he really only is on screen in the end. Beowulf fights this dragon in the end of Beowulf. That dragon is only really in the end. Same with Game of Thrones. She hatches those dragons in the end of the first book, but we don't really see dragons until the very end. So these books we're not going to be reading in our journey through different dragon books.
Yeah, it's a great example of what we're going to do and we're going to be reading about. So if you're excited to hear some books about dragons, keep following along. We've talked about this, but we should share with our readers, why are we talking about dragons? What sparked our interest?
Would you like to share first why you are interested in reading about dragons?
Sure. A friend of mine that you may never have met, who is a good friend of mine in middle school and high school, I once asked her what she was reading, and she would only read dragon books. Like, she's like, I don't care what the book's about, it just has to have a dragon. And that's always made me curious, because I never read any of the books that she read. And I was like, what is it like when you only read dragon books? Like, what themes persist? What's different? What's new and exciting? Like, what holds all, not fantasy books, dragon books. So I've always been curious as like, if you only read dragon books, like, what does that look like? What are you reading? How are you experiencing it? What themes are across time? So that's what really sparked my interest in dragons. And now, 15 years later, I'm finally getting to it.
Yeah, so I am much like your friend, actually. So I first found a love of dragons after watching the movie Dragonheart, where the dragon in Dragonheart is actually voiced by Sean Connery. I loved that movie when I was a child. It was such a wonderful movie where this dragon, for once, wasn't evil. It was this kind of complex, in my mind as a child, I haven't watched it in a long time, kind of complex character that had a good side and an evil side. And was working with the characters, the protagonists of the plot, to keep moving forward. And that really sparked my interest in finding books where the dragons weren't the villains. And so in elementary school and middle school, I was much like your friend, where any book about dragons I just needed to read, to the point where I had a teacher who said to me, I've had a lot of horse girls in my classes, but I've never had a dragon girl. And you were my first dragon girl. And I was really proud of that. I was really proud of that moniker, even as I was also very much a horse girl at that age too. No hate to horse girls. You are all welcome here in this podcast as well. But yeah, I was always a dragon girl as well. And I'm really excited to start back into these dragon books with you.
And boy, what a start.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah, we have a lot to discuss. And we have been kind of discussing this constantly while we've been reading it and then being like, no, we have to save it for the podcast.
Yeah.
We have a lot to talk about because a lot of stuff happens in this book. Did you want to start us off with a plot synopsis?
Sure. And this is going to be a pretty detailed synopsis. We are not afraid of spoilers here.
This is a pro spoiler podcast.
So if you do not want any spoilers for this book that was written in the 1960s, I would maybe log off now, read this book, and then come back. But our first book is titled Dragonflight by Anne Mccaffrey. It was published in 1968 and is part of a huge series that is 24 books long. There are a few short story collections within this world of Pern. So you might think that that name sounds familiar, but Dragonflight might not be ringing a bell. It may be because you've read a later book in the series. Her son and her daughter have also both written books within the series as well and are continuing to publish after her death. So this is a very long-lived series that focuses on different characters in different timelines, but we are only focusing on this first one today.
And just to give an explanation why we picked this book over a bunch of other books, as we go through and explore dragons and dragons throughout books, we kind of wanted to start at the beginning. And this is one of the earliest depictions of dragons, sort of in this genre. Obviously, there's historical depictions of dragons, but within the canon we're sort of looking at, this is one of the earliest. So we wanted to see what one of the what's the word I'm looking for, like seminal works of the genre was like. And that's why we picked this book over maybe one of her more popular books.
Yeah, so when people talk about books that really established modern fantasy, they talk about Tolkien, they talk about Dune often when they talk about books that establish modern sci-fi. Wheel of Time is another one that does get thrown out, but the Dragonriders of Pern is the book that people talk about when they're talking about the modern fantasy sci-fi equivalent of the Mother of Dragons, to quote another famous series. All right, so when this book starts out with an introduction that tells us that it's going to be a little sci-fi. We learn that this planet, the planet of Pern, that this book takes place on, was actually colonized by interplanetary travelers from an Earth called Terran and then forgotten about. So there are people on this planet that don't remember that they were part of this interplanetary, very futuristic society. And we also learn that this planet has an irregular orbit around its sun, and that brings it very close to another planet in its solar system every so often, but at irregular intervals. And that planet is called by the people of Pern the Red Star. And when that red star gets, even though it's a planet, gets very close to our planet of Pern, something called the threads descend upon our planet. And those threads are very, very dangerous to life on Pern. That's our introduction. So it is a little sci-fi, which is kind of exciting. As we get into the book, it does feel a little more fantasy. Our first character who is introduced is Lessa. And Lessa wakes up in chapter 1 to a bad feeling that she walks outside to. She's sleeping in the cheese room of a kitchen. She's described as having ragged clothes. She's this low-class servant in this house. She walks outside and she looks towards the horizon at dawn. And we get some exposition that she actually was a part of the ruling family of this hold 10 years ago, or 10 turns ago, as years are called in Pern. A man named Fax came and slaughtered her entire family and took over the hold. And she was able to survive by hiding in a Watchweir's cave. And a Watchweir seems to be like a dragon-like creature, but isn't exactly dragon-like. So she walks outside because she has this just premonition. She feels like something bad is going to happen, and she sees the red star on the horizon, though she recognizes that that probably isn't what woke her up. We also learn in this very first chapter that Lessa is extremely skinny. It's mentioned multiple times how thin she is, which is very important because she is often described in contrast to the other women of this novel who are not as skinny as she is, often described in terms of their weight and as if their weight is part of their moral being. There is a lot of inherent misogyny in this book. Anything you'd like to add so far, JoJo?
Nope, you nailed it. Very skinny. I mean,
Yeah.
she's literally starving,
Yeah.
which is part of it. But, she's still skinny throughout the book, even
Yeah.
after years and years. But we'll get to that. Well, then we introduce
Yeah, the actual
the real
protagonist.
protagonist of yeah.
In the next chapter, we meet Falar and his brother, his half-brother, Fëanor. And Falar and Fëanor are two dragon riders. Falar rides a bronze dragon named, and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Menmeth? Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah. In my head, it's just a collection of syllables. I don't really pronounce things unless I have to, which is bad for a podcast.
Yeah, well, Menmeth is a fantastic character. I like Menmeth better than Falar. And Fëanor's dragon is a brown dragon named Canth. And we'll talk about the dragon hierarchy in a minute. Falar is the leader of what is called a wing, which is, his group of dragons. And we learn that they are looking for a woman who will be able to bond the next queen dragon, and it has to be a woman. So they arrive at Fax's hold, and remember, Fax is who killed Lessa's entire family. And they really dislike Fax, partially because he is now the hold leader of, 9 holds?
I believe it's 6 or 7, yeah.
Multiple holds, when tradition dictates that you should only be the leader of one hold. One man, one hold is what they say. So they don't like him. They also don't like that he's not adhering to other traditions, one of which they note there is vegetation growing around the hold, which we later learn the threads are drawn to vegetation because they need vegetation to take hold. And once the threads take hold of vegetation, they completely destroy the entire landscape. So there's a rule that you can't have any vegetation around a hold because it's so dangerous to the people living there. I'm not sure how that works with growing food. Apparently food is different. I don't know.
They have fields that are separate from the holds, which they talk about later. I mean, I do think an important thing to bring up now is tradition is portrayed as a moral good, in that the people who have tradition are the moral characters, and tradition is used as a stand-in for moral behavior, and that the people who do not perform tradition are immoral. Lessa and Falar are very traditional characters. And then they do change that later in the book.
Yeah, except Falar. Yeah, when Falar breaks tradition, it's okay. But when others break tradition, it's not okay.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Yeah. A great aspect of this scene when they meet Fax is they are incredibly petty and passive-aggressive to Fax. They kind of make fun of him. They make passive-aggressive comments about the food that is sitting out in the hall when they're walking through the Great Hall. They're just really needling him in a way that's quite fantastic, in my opinion. I really enjoyed that. They're right off the bat, as soon as we meet them, just really passive-aggressive to Fax. And Fax doesn't really want to introduce them to his women because he doesn't want them to potentially take from him. But he does. He does take them to his women. And this is really where we first see Falar's woman problem. So when he takes them to the rooms, the quarters that the women are kept, it's in Falar's perspective. And he does say, I'm just going to read from the book, that the chamber was richly hung with appropriately gentle scenes of women occupied in all manner of feminine tasks. Right away, we get this idea that Falar thinks that women has these kind of contradictory views about women, because he thinks that appropriately gentle scenes are the scenes that these women should be exposed to. And then yet, when he describes the women in the hall, he calls these women too plump and small. And that is literally quoting the words that the book uses, plump and small, that they had no fight in them. He says that these women probably were being abused by Fax in some way. And because of that abuse, it makes them really that the fight has been beaten out of them, that the fight has been taken out of them. So they're not worthy of being the weird woman that they're looking for.
I mean, the whole phrase
Yeah.
take me to your women really sets up the whole book,
Yeah.
where it's just like women are this separate class, but also just like off to the sides, and the men strut around
Mhm.
and make all of the decisions.
There is a lot of gender essentialism in this book, a lot of division based on gender, a lot of idea that if you are this gender, there's just no, this is what your life is going to be. I don't believe that Anne Mccaffrey understood that queer people exist or that trans people exist. She seemed to write this book as if, I mean, it was written in the 60s, and we have to keep remembering that this was a product of its time, even though we can still dissect the problematic parts of it that really we don't need to accept them in 2024. But yeah, right away we see Fullar's woman problem. He does meet Fax's actual wife, even though it's implied that Fax is having relations with all of these women. And Fax's actual wife's name is Gemma. And Gemma is pregnant currently with one of Fax's children. And Fullar does note that he thinks that Gemma probably would make a good weird woman if she weren't so old, because she is getting towards middle age, and the people who bond with dragons need to be younger. And that's because the dragon's life is linked to the life of the rider, which is another popular trope we see in these dragon books. So they are, they're pretty dissatisfied with the women they see, but they decide to go see their friend, Lytall, who's living this hold. And Lytall was a dragon rider, and he is one of the rare dragon riders who was able to live past the death of his dragon. So after his dragon died, he left where the dragon riders live. The dragon riders live in places called weirs, and he's really portrayed as like this pitiable man, because this idea of living past your own dragon is quite disturbing for dragon riders, and that is because of the strength of that bond that they have with their dragons. And it's also quite rare. Usually when one dies, the other one dies. And we'll get into what happens when the rider dies and the dragon, doesn't, because it's actually quite a beautiful scene in the later part of the book when this does happen, when a rider does die. We also learn from Lytall, who has now become a weaver, that Fax is trying to stop the teachings surrounding the threads and all of the histories of the dragon men, and why it's very important to be respectful of the dragon men. So there's, again, this link of tradition being tied to inherent goodness. Lytall finally just suggests to them to go to Ruatha, because that's where the best weir women have been found. And Ruatha is where Lessa is currently residing and where her family used to rule. So they go to Ruatha. And we go back into Lessa's point of view, where we learn that she has actually been slowly sabotaging Ruatha since it was taken over. So she is the only surviving person from her family line. And the only reason she was able to survive was because she hid in the Watchweir's den. Other than her, everyone of what's called the Blood, which is that dragon man blood, has been killed. Her slow sabotage of Ruatha has been to make it so financially inviable for Fax, because she's trying to get him to see it more as a liability and renounce his claim on it. What do you think, Jo, of the sabotaging act?
Oh, it reminded me a lot of forms of protest in
Mhm.
other communities that are, like, under oppression,
Mhm.
like a lot of worker slowdowns that you see, though they did take it it's not just that, like, they're just, like, slowing down the work, they're, like, letting, like, crops rot in the field by not picking it, they're, like, badly cooking steaks, it's all over. So I actually thought it was, like, a really interesting the first part of the book has a lot of class in it, like, you see that
Mhm.
in the way that Lessa is treated, because she's basically hiding out as, like a cook wench sort of thing person.
Yeah, they call her a drudge.
Yeah, she's pretending to be dirty. So, to me, I thought it was really interesting that Lessa was essentially leading a workers' revolt against Fax.
Mhm.
That kind of class consciousness does not really exist in the book, but,
No.
you know, things can rhyme unintentionally.
Yeah, and I think that it almost works. The reason I think it doesn't actually work is because she seems like she's the only one who is aware that she's active. It doesn't seem that she is trying to organize people to work with her. Her actions actively result in the punishment and death of other people some of whom she would call her people, right? And the fact that she is from that ruling family kind of changes the perspective a bit, where it kind of feels like, well, if I can't have it, nobody can. And I'm willing to destroy every single person's life in this community just to get my revenge. So I think in that sense, it still has problematic elements to it. I do wish that she had worked with the other people in the working class that she now is finding herself in more so, but the book didn't really have time for that. I don't know. How do you feel? How do you feel about that?
I mean, there's not much to say. Like, Lessa is very clearly self-interested, which you'll see later in the book
Mhm.
and gets, like, called out for it. Do you wanna just talk about the Fax and Flar scene?
Sure. Yeah, Lissa is a very flawed character, which I find quite interesting. They get to the castle, and right away the dragons are like, someone is here. They know that someone is there that is going to be a good choice. And Falar, Fax, Fedor, and a bunch of, all the riders, as well as the ladies in waiting and Gemma, sit down for a meal that Lessa has also purposefully sabotaged. Maybe magic. Her magic is very lightly described, but she does seem to have some significant influence over the world around her when she attempts it.
There definitely seems to be 2 sections of this book.
Mhm.
Um, like, the section we're currently in, and then, the section sort of in the Wirens, is that how you say it?
Wires?
Weirs? Yeah, the sections in the Weir after, like, we're done with Ruith, and, they're just, like, they're kinda separate. I know that Dragonflight was based off of a short story, so I'm
Oh.
wondering if that's part of why there's scene of halfway through.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah, so the men all sit down to eat, and women sit down to eat, and Fax is really angry about the quality of the meal, and he says, when this hold can no longer like support itself, then I will denounce it, which Lessa is like internally like jumping for joy because this is what she's been waiting for 10 years. Then at that moment, Gemma does go into labor.
Which is maybe caused by Lessa, it is so unclear.
It's very unclear. And the dragon men are continuing to like kind of needle Fax. So Fax basically says, if she gives birth to a boy and he lives, then I will relinquish my hold to him. And the dragon men say, heard and witnessed. And this kind of shows that class structure where dragon riders are kind of at the very top of society, higher than the hold lords. And it doesn't seem like there is a higher power within this governmental system.
Okay, so there's a quote about class that I found really interesting,
Mhm.
and I was a little bit frustrated when class sort of disappeared from the book later,
Yeah.
but I think it really shows what we see in the first couple of chapters is like a really stratified society where you have the hold lord it's on top, and then you have the women, and then you have like the craftsmen, and then you have the drudges, which are women that you don't want to procreate with, and there's a lot of stuff. But then you have the dragon riders, and they're literally described as a close-knit society of easy equals. It's implied that like the dragon riders are above the class structures of the holds, and they have their own society of equals where there's not a separation of men based on birth, which kind of isn't true because like the different riders have different positions, and then also the
Yeah.
women aren't equal. It's a very
And the dragons themselves have a structure of hierarchy
yeah.
that only the bronze dragons can mate. So yeah, that's really not true at all.
No, it's what they think about the class within the
Mhm.
book, which is interesting.
Yeah, that is quite interesting. Getting back to the plot, Lessa decides, I mean, she is kind of roped into helping Gemma give birth, and trigger warning, this is a pretty harsh scene. It's a very harsh depiction of childbirth, where Gemma is having like a hard time giving birth. And it seems almost as if Lessa is using some kind of magical powers to make it worse and make it harder. It's described that Lessa like purposefully squeezes her hand really, really hard. And through the act of childbirth, Gemma does unfortunately pass away. She dies, which I did really like Gemma's character. I wish we had more of Gemma. And right after she dies before the child is born. Lessa runs from the room and announces to the Dragonriders and to Fax that the child lives and it is a boy. Because she is hoping that the child will actually die, so that Fax will relinquish his hold or his power over the hold, and then the child will be dead, so there will be no one to take over the hold. But Fax just like slaps the crap out of Lessa, knocks her down a bunch of stairs. She passes out, and he's so angry he doesn't want to relinquish his power. So Falair has to duel him. And what follows is actually a pretty gritty fight. I wish there was honestly a little bit more of this in the book. This is really the only real fight scene we get in this whole book.
I am a fan of a good fight scene. Some of my problems with books are when they pull away from fight scenes. Like, this is a good fight scene. Like, it's one of the better parts.
It is a good fight scene. Yeah, it's like gritty. They're like kicking each other in the crotch. They're throwing like the hot fat from the dinner table at each other to try to, get it in their eyes. Falar gets a really nasty gash on his shoulder, but he does in the end kill Fax. And then he goes and sees what's going on with Lessa because he kind of starts to realize, oh, maybe she's the woman. And he takes her and looks at her. He finds out that she's purposefully blurring her image with magic so that people won't look at her or notice her. And he realizes that this is the woman that they are seeking. So after a conversation that's pretty tense, he convinces her that she would actually be better. Her life would be better if she were a dragon rider. She would be in a higher position than if she were just the leader of Ruatha, while the I forgot to mention this, but the child was actually born alive, and
surprise, the kid lived.
And the kid is a boy, so that child will take over control of Ruatha once he comes of age. And Lessa is enraged by this. So he tells her, it's better to be a dragon rider, to be a weir woman is what they're called, than it is to be just the leader of Ruatha while this kid is growing up. Fëanor does suggest, and this does come to pass, where Lytal will be kind of the leader of it's called a warder in this book of Ruatha while they're waiting for the child to come of age, which causes also Lessa to be very hateful towards Lytal as well. So they go to the Bendon Weir, which is where all the dragons live. And the way that they travel to the Bendon Weir is they do something called going between, which is a really beautiful mechanic. I actually really like the mechanic of going between. Do you want to describe it?
Sure. I think they sort of elaborate it later in the book, but they describe it as being somewhere cold and dark, and it usually takes about 3 breaths. And it really does feel like the word liminal has a bunch of definitions, but an absence of space where they go through, and then they appear wherever they imagined. So they travel from Ruath to the Weir within an instant, and they're there.
Yeah, so it's a form of teleportation that the dragons are able to do. And anyone who is on the dragon's back also is carried with them through this act of teleportation. I kind of feel like it's the feeling of being at the very top of a roller coaster right before it falls.
I've always thought about it as wormhole travel,
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's what it actually is. But I the feeling that is described feels like that feeling of weightlessness and almost dread, but not quite, that exhilaration that comes with that expectation of moving somewhere really fast without actually moving at all.
Yeah, moving between is really important in this book, so they do it a lot.
Yeah, huge plot point.
Huge plot.
So they travel between and they go to Ruatha, and this is where the timeline starts to have these really huge time jumps, and then these really slow crawls. So they go to the Bendon Weir, and Lessa takes an extremely long path, which is also described kind of in a gritty way. She describes clumps of hair coming off of her head. This is her first bath maybe in 10 years, as she's trying to scrub all the filth from her. And so she takes this really long bath that's like described for a long time, which makes sense because if she hasn't bathed, I think I would take a long bath too. And while she's doing this, Falar goes with Menmeth eat. And Menmeth is so delightful here because he's like, I'm hungry. It's time for dinner. And Fëanor has already taken his dragon to eat, but you haven't taken me, Menmeth, bronze dragon, to eat yet. And it's very cute. We get this look into the relationship between the two. So Falar takes Menmeth to where they keep all the herd beasts, which is what the animals are called that they feed on. And while Menmeth kind of hunts them down and eats them, Fëanor is kind of having just a conversation with Falar, or Falar is having a conversation with Fëanor. Well, they're having a conversation with each other.
Also, I should say, while Lessa is bathing, Falar's like, girls do be shopping, but about bathing, it's just like,
Yeah.
the dragon is being so lovely, and Falar's like, oh, women. And it's just like, come on, dude.
Yeah, and I think that Fëanor also is like, she's ugly. And then Falar's like, Jorah was pretty, and look where Jorah got us. And Jorah, because I haven't explained who Jorah was the weir woman before Lessa. And basically the way that the society is structured is there's a dragon queen, and the dragon queen is the mother of all the other dragons in the weir. She is the only female dragon who can mate, though it seems as if there are other female dragons, but they are not able to reproduce in the same way.
They don't let them mate, is really
Well, they
what they
eat,
say.
yeah. Well, they eat this thing called dragonstone, and the dragonstone also has this secondary side effect where it acts kind of like a dragon birth control. And so the queen dragon is not allowed to eat the dragonstone. So Jorah was the bonded weirwoman to that queen dragon, and she died recently. So but thankfully before she died, her dragon laid another queen egg. And that is what the dragon that is in that egg is who they hope that Lessa will bond. Often Jorah is described as being beautiful, but at the same time incompetent, obese, stupid, and lazy.
They frequently curse her name. They're like, oh, if only Jorah hadn't been, we would be in a better position. It's
Right.
like, oh, there's 3 female characters. Write her some positive attributes.
Yeah, and Lessa is the only positive, or portrayed as the only positive female character, other than maybe Minora and Gemma, and who Gemma dies. So there's definitely this like inherent misogyny to this world. So they talk amongst themselves while Menmeth feeds, and you learn over the course of the book that dragons and humans have kind of a symbiotic relationship, and part of the human's duty in being bonded to the dragon is just keeping them from like overeating, so they can kind of control how much their dragon eats, so that the dragon doesn't just deplete an entire area of creatures. So once Falar gets back, he asks Lessa to treat the wound on his shoulder. She kind of is trying to ask him questions about the hatching ceremony, which he doesn't answer because he doesn't want to give her any more information than he was given when he was in the hatching ceremony, because again, that tradition. Oh, I also do want to mention that she like looks at herself before he comes back in like the reflection of a shield, and she's kind of making note of how skinny she is, but then she does want us to know that she does have large breasts. Even though she's been malnourished since the age of 10, her breasts are fully developed.
She's a hottie with a body. Just make sure everybody knows.
She got those curves. Yeah, which like is probably pretty I mean, I don't know, but it seems maybe that would be unusual if you were malnourished since before you hit puberty, because she probably hadn't hit puberty yet at the age of 10, or she was just starting puberty, that she would still have developed breasts when she was that small, because her fat reserve nothing. I don't know if that's true or not, but it seems unlikely that she would be well endowed if she was that thin.
Yeah, I think it's less about whether or not she would have the body that she would have, but more about the fact that the author is like, don't worry, she's skinny and hot, everybody out there. And it's like, okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's actually happening. The author wants us to know that she's secretly beautiful now that she has cleaned all the dirt from her body.
Yeah, she took her glasses off and then undid her ponytail, and now
Yeah.
she's ready to be queen.
Yeah, like, even though she didn't brush her hair for 10 years, she's still able to brush it out with just her fingers, which, again, also would not really be possible. It would have been matted, and she describes her hair as still being waist length after she finger brushes it out and after massive clumps of it are falling out of her head, as she's bathing, which, again, just like what I know this is a fantasy world, but they probably would have in reality if this was like, and this has like some moments of realism, like that gritty fight that we watched between Pilar and Fax. Like, you would have to shave someone's head if they haven't brushed their hair in 10 years and just let it grow. Anyway, but she's beautiful, guys. She's gorgeous. But I do love that they talk about how staticky her hair is now that it's clean. It's just like sticking up. I did like that detail that it gets staticky.
There's some like really good parts in this book if you walk around all of the landmines.
Yeah. Yeah. So time moves forward, and the dragon eggs are ready to be hatched. So they're starting to hatch, and the hatching ceremony begins. It takes place in this space that has really like warm sand. The eggs are all placed in this warm sand kind of arena. So we have all of the other eggs, the eggs that are not the queen egg, in one area, and then we have the queen egg in a different area. And surrounding all the regular dragon eggs are all these little boys. Described as children, they're described as little boys. And standing near the queen egg are women, and they are described as adult women, which was weird for me at first, because I was like, oh, why do the women have to be women? Wouldn't they also want children to bond the queen dragon? Well, we will get to why that is important in a minute. So these little boys are standing around these dragon eggs. They start to hatch. And as they hatch, these boys are kind of stoically like allowing these dragons to maul them if the dragons want to maul them. So it's described that this one dragon, because he's trying to get to another dragon, just climbs over this boy, knocks him down, and because their claws are so sharp, it just digs huge gashes in this little boy. And the boy kind of just takes it. He allows it to happen. And then when another dragon comes up to him, the boy's like saying, oh no, don't worry, it doesn't hurt that bad, he didn't mean to, I'm okay, to this dragon that he's then bonding with, even though he is probably in a great deal of pain. And that's kind of a sweet little look into the way the bond affects you when it first snaps into place, because it's obvious that this boy is feeling the emotions of this dragon that he's just bonded with, and he's trying to comfort the fear in that dragon, and that is overtaking his experience of pain in that moment. So that was an interesting little look into the way that bond works. However, as this is happening, as these dragons are hatching and these little boys are bonding with them, all of the women, who are adult women, are freaking out. They're screaming, they're crying, they're trying to hide, they're trying to run away, except for Lessa, because as we've said many times, Lessa is not like other girls. Lessa is trying to figure out what the boys are doing to get the dragons to bond with them, because it's obvious that they brought in all of these women for the queen dragon to pick one of, and she wants to be that one, which we know that she's going to be that one because she's the only one that's not freaking out. So after all the baby dragons hatch and pair off with their boys, the boys that are left are taken off out of the arena, and the boys who were able to bond the dragons are taken to their new kind of quarters. And then the queen egg starts to hatch. And when the queen egg hatches, the dragon that comes out, whose name is Ramath, immediately mauls one of the women and kills her, goes after another one, really drags her down. And Lessa takes this opportunity to grab the dragon by the head and force it to look at her. And then the bond snaps into place. And this is one of my favorite descriptions in the book. When Lessa looks into the eyes of Ramath, whose eyes are rainbow, by the way. She has rainbow eyes. It's described, and I'm just going to read it. A feeling of joy suffused Lessa, a feeling of warmth, tenderness, unalloyed, an instant respect. Admiration flooded mind and heart and soul. Never again would Lessa lack an advocate, a defender, an intimate, aware instantly of the temper of her mind and heart and of her desires. How wonderful was Lessa, the thought intruded into Lessa's reflections. How pretty, how kind, how thoughtful, how brave and clever. So she's getting inundated with the thoughts from the dragon as well, as she's thinking of how wonderful it is to have this bond with this dragon. And it's just, I really did like that description. I loved, I don't know, what did you think of that moment?
definitely one of the most beautiful moments of the book. You really get a sense for, because they start off the book sort of talking a lot about how good, beautiful the bond is, how important it is. We see someone who's had their bond severed and they're like
Mhm.
half a person. And then to see the point of connection to really drive home how bonded these people are. It is just like a beautiful relationship, especially because we've seen all of these humans kind of being shitty to each other. And it's just like this is like a lovely, pure relation people have.
Yeah, it really almost feels like the way people, I'm not a mother, but the way people describe when they look at their child for the first time after giving birth, that feeling of like wholeness is how you really feel this bond feels like. So Lessa now has a dragon, and then we jump 2 years in time.
Is it 2 years? Here's the thing, is they'll just, like, jump forward in time, and you'll have no idea, and then they'll just be like, "Oh, that was ages ago," and you're like, "It was 2 pages ago, what are you talking about?"
Yeah, the time works really weird in this book, which maybe makes sense because of what we will find out later. Yeah, I think it's about 2 years. It's at least a year. And we come upon Lessa in a lesson with about the history of dragon riders, and she's extremely bored. Her teachers are two dragon riders, one of whom is named Ragul, and he is the current Weir leader. And again, this is another example that we will see where we are told constantly that Ragul is bad, he is weak, he is misguided, he is not a good ruler. We're told this constantly, but the actual actions that he takes don't really seem to be that bad. You know, they're not like great, but the characters end up getting what they want all the time anyway. So it seems like there's not really a problem with them. I don't know.
It's funny because this is when the binary of tradition equals good and
Mhm.
break from tradition equals bad, like, immediately flips, where Rugal is the representation of, like, overly adhering to tradition to the point where he makes himself small compared to the holds, and he tries to, like, not make any trouble with the other holds and, like, kind of keep the peace, and his meekness is really, like, what people do not like about him. It's like a weird change because for the first part, it's all like you can tell who is a good person by their adherence to like the old tradition, and then all of a sudden we're like, oh, this guy sucks. All he does is like talk about tradition and like won't shake down the hold leaders
Mhm.
because they haven't been like the Wyrens don't like support themselves at all.
No.
They're literally like lords on top of lords who get all of their food and supplies from the other lords. This is where you find out that they're kind of like a protection racket where like when the threads come, they handle them, and then that why they should deserve to get all the money from the holds, and the holds are like, threads are never coming back,
Right.
man, so like we don't need to feed you. And this is also sort of where we see a big conflict between Rugal and Falar, which I'm sure
Mhm.
you're going to explain better
Yeah.
about. This is when there's like this whole middle section of the book where
A lot of council scenes, a lot of politicking that is extremely boring.
it's all about whether or not the threads are going to come back, and you as a reader are like pretty sure the threads are going to come back.
Yeah, I bet those threads are gonna come back. I don't know about you.
Yeah, they're going to be like so hot. Like you just wait and you'll see.
And to this point, the threads have not actually been described, so you have no idea what that means whenever they talk about the threads. You just know that they're bad.
But boy did they talk about the threads.
Which maybe is because they don't really know what to expect with the threads, but no, they do, because Falar, when he actually does see the threads, he's like, "Oh, I thought they would look like this, but they actually look like this." But his estimation of what they would look like was pretty accurate, so it still didn't make much sense. Anyway, but yeah, Lessa is in a history lesson with Ragul, and she's like, "I don't want to learn this," and he is saying, "No, you have to. You have to memorize all of these things." Which later, it's really important that she has memorized all these stories. But does Ragul get any recognition for that? Absolutely not. Anyway, their history lesson is interrupted by Minora, who's one of the only other women in this story. She's actually Fenor's mother. I don't know if you knew that.
I did know that. I forgot though. Yeah. They're like so weird about family relationships in this.
Yeah. I want to talk about that in depth in a minute.
Sure.
So Minora interrupts this fight that Lessa is having with Ragul and the other teacher whose name I forget because he's really not important, where she wants to fly around on Ramoth, her dragon, but queen dragons don't fly. Even though she has wings, Ragul is saying queen dragons only fly when they are flying to mate. So there's this mating ritual that dragons have where the female will take off and then the other dragons will chase her. And otherwise, they do not fly. The weir woman who is bonded to them does not ride them. And Lessa hates this because she really wants to go between. She's like watching all these little boys who are learning how to go between, and she's extremely envious of them. Minora interrupts this conversation to tell them what JoJo just said, which is that they haven't received the tithes that they need from the hold lords. They are not going to be sufficient to last the cold season, which Lessa is very angry about. And she says that we as dragon men should start raiding. We should just start raiding and stealing what we deserve. And Ragul is like, no, we can't do that. We have never had a conflict over tithes. We'll make do. It will be fine. But Lessa doesn't want to listen to this. So she talks to Minora and she takes matters into her own hands to persuade one of the younger dragon riders to start raiding. She also has this weird scene with Falar where she's bathing Ramoth because Ramoth is growing so fast that her skin is shedding constantly, so she has to be bathed a lot. And she's with Falar, and they learn that the holds have actually all had surpluses in this past year, and they learned this from Lytal, who's the only hold lord who gave them the actual share that they needed. And Lessa is even more angered, and she's like, "We need to raid." And Falar's like, "No, just don't. We'll deal with it." And what he is actually saying, without telling her, is that he is already conducting very subtle raids that she is not aware of. So they just aren't communicating with each other. And there is a meeting of the riders on how to proceed, where we get some exposition about why Falar is not the weird leader and why Ragul is. Do you want to describe what happened here?
Sure. It's an important scene, but it's also stupid, which is
Mhm.
Falar's dad was the last weir leader, and he was being raised to be the new weir leader, but his dad died when he was 19, and he just wasn't old enough or Memeth wasn't old enough to like make the flight, and Rugul swooped in, which is probably a good thing because I don't know if it's always true, but the bronze rider of the bronze dragon that like mates with the gold dragon fucks the gold dragon's rider, or maybe that just happened later.
No, it seems that is the case, but Jorah was not Falar's mother.
Yeah, but he still would have had to
Yeah, it
fuck
was
his
still his
stepmom.
stepmom, which is really weird.
So
Especially
weird.
since so as JoJo said, basically the bronze rider whose dragon mates with the golden dragon is the weird leader. This also means that their governmental structure is absurd because there's a point later where Falar says to Lessa, Ramoth should be mating twice a year and laying clutches of eggs twice a year, which means that if a dragon were to like a different dragon were to mate with her, their leader could change every 6 months, which is ridiculously that doesn't work. Now, Fëanor does say that it's not always the strongest dragon who is able to mate with the gold dragon. There is it has a little bit to do with the will of the rider who is bonded with the dragon. So like Lessa will have some control over who Ramoth decides to mate with. It's not necessarily just the dragon who is the fastest. But still, it's kind of odd. You could really destabilize a weir just by changing that mated pair every 6 months.
So Falar's grumpy,
Yeah.
and we find the reason that Falar's so grumpy is because he should be the rightful king,
Mm-hmm.
but he wasn't fast enough at 19, so now the mating of Ramath is like really important because that's gonna select the leader for the next one. So
Yeah, they're also hoping that she'll lay another queen egg, so then they're not only depending on Ramoth to continue the dragon lines. So in this council meeting, which lasts way too long, we do again have Ragul saying, we have never raided, we have never started a conflict with the holds for this. And he's really kind of put in this position again, as JoJo said, as this villain for not wanting a conflict. And so Lessa persuades a young dragon rider to raid, which he gets caught. And Falar gets really mad at Lessa. And he's like, you should have just left it to us. We were doing it discreetly. You just didn't know about it. Which, like, maybe you should have told her. I don't know, but maybe you should have told her. So Falar has to go after this dragon rider. And so he goes between to bring him back. But as he goes between to bring him back and leaves the weir, that is when Ramoth wakes up and is ready.
Ready to fuck.
Ready to fuck. Yeah, she's ready for it. She wakes up and she's immediately like, oh yeah, it's time. So Fëanor is like, Lessa, you cannot just allow Ramoth to gorge herself, because Ramoth is always hungry because she's growing so much. If you let her gorge herself, she won't fly very far. And Ragul's dragon, I think his name is Hath, will absolutely be able to catch her. You need to just only allow her to drink the blood of the animals that she catches. So they're like in the feeding ground. Ramoth is pissed at Lessa for not letting her eat.
It's really interesting because this is probably the first time in the book where we really get to see the dragon rider dragon dynamic. I mean, you see sort of like Falar and Nemeth flying together and they're like chatting and they're buddies, but this is one of the first times where you see like why humans are important to like what they bring to this, where like Lessa is controlling Rameth with her mind, trying to like make sure she only drinks the blood of the beasts that she's killing, so like she can fly very far and fast, because apparently that's important for the mate. Like, you learn so much about
dragon husbandry.
Like, that is like so in depth and detailed.
Yeah.
Like, that's a lot of this book is about just dragon mating.
Yeah, the dragon husbandry. And Fëanor also tells Lessa that the longer the flight is, the longer that pursuing of Ramoth is, that the dragons are chasing her, the more eggs she lays.
It's about, she's got to be a big, strong girl, otherwise she's going to be like Jorah, and it's not going to work out well.
Or Jorah's dragon, Nemorth,
Yeah,
I think is the name of Jorah's dragon. We all like Ramoth is Ramoth is Nemorth's child. But it's constantly also described that Ramoth is so much bigger than her mother, that she's so much better, she's a stronger dragon. And I think they're trying to make this connection between, because Lessa is of a higher moral standing than Jorah, Ramoth is a better dragon.
There's no genetics involved in this. It's all vibes. No. Especially because everyone's just breeding with their parents, you know?
Yeah. But yet, Ragul's dragon is like the second largest dragon in the hold, only second to Menmeth, who's Falar's dragon. So the size of his dragon is huge, even though he's like a villain character. It's very confusing. Yeah, it is just vibes. So they're very worried that Falar isn't going to make it back in time to mate with Ramoth, and that Ragul's dragon Hath will mate with Ramoth instead, and he'll continue being weird leader. But as we all knew, Falar gets back in time, and he's kind of like ha 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 about it. He's like, I was able to get back. And it kind of almost feels like this was like a plot that Ragul had set up, even though he had literally nothing to do with any of the moving pieces. So it didn't make sense.
Just like Lessa maybe causing what's her name? Gemma's. Just like it seems like Lessa is maybe responsible for Gemma going into pregnancy early and like not knowing it. It kind of feels like Ragul planned to send Falar away so he wouldn't be around when the breeding happened, even though there's no possible way that he could have done it.
And it's never addressed again. It's never later addressed in the book, like, oh, so you were involved in this, or you did like tip off a hold leader so that this dragon rider would get caught. That's never brought up. So it doesn't seem like it's the case. Also, this was supposed to kind of, I think, be written as a buildup of tension, but because within 2 pages that Falar leaves to get the Dragon Rider and then comes back and is able to return, there's really no tension there. And this is something that happens a lot in this book where you're like, I know this is going to happen. And there's no tension because you didn't bring this up earlier. Like if Falar had been gone for days and days because maybe the Dragon Rider had been detained and he had to persuade the Hold Leader to release the Dragon Rider, then yeah, it would make more sense. But he was gone for like, what feels like minutes because they can jump in between. So they don't, it's not even like they have travel time. The travel time is 3 breaths and he's there. So it made no sense. But anyway, Ramoth is like, it's time. And she takes flight and she's beautiful and golden. And the mating ceremony begins. And she's like, Ramoth is turned on, which means that Lessa is turned on because they share emotions. It's also described, I do want to just mention before we start talking about this extremely problematic scene, that dragons live in the moment. They don't linger on the past and they don't worry about the future. What they're feeling now is what they're feeling now, and what they feel later is what they feel later. And they don't have this concept of regret or worry. And that does come up multiple times in the book. And this is something that Ramoth is it's described Ramoth is having right now in this moment where she's like, I'm ready to mate. I wasn't even thinking about it the day before, but now I am.
Yeah, it's definitely a weird shift in the behavior where she's like, all right, time to go.
Yeah. And would you like to describe what happens next?
Oh, gosh, me?
I mean, I can.
No, it's fine.
But I would like to say before we describe it, just trigger warnings for very dubious consent. So just be aware of that as we describe this upcoming scene.
So yeah, Les is like completely overwhelmed with whatever. She's so excited because she didn't know Ramoth could fly. Ragul is like basically implied that like despite the fact that golden dragons have wings, they can't fly. And like you know that he's like it's too dangerous for like, a golden dragon to go away because if she dies then like we're out of dragons, we can't reproduce anymore. Les is lied to and led to believe that her dragon can't fly. So when like
Yeah, well, to this point, whenever Ramoth has flown, she's described as flying really awkwardly, and Lessa is not able to actually ride her. She's usually riding on when they like go to the feeding ground. Ramoth feels really unsteady in the air. But then when she takes flight for the mating flight, she's extremely strong and graceful.
so Les is like Ramoth's off. Les is like all zoinked out, and like Fëanor has her like by both shoulders, like he's like holding onto her.
Yeah, he's physically holding her up and giving her advice on how to proceed.
Yeah, he's like,
through
you
this.
gotta stay focused on her. You gotta be in her head so she doesn't get too far away. Like he's like forcing her live inside of her dragon's mind and like kind of
Like, control it.
her.
Yeah, and not just be overwhelmed by the emotion that is coming with Ramoth's.
Yeah, so she's being yelled at and like moved around, and then the dragons are like off flying. It's like it's like kind of an okay scene. Like you get the perspective of Ramoth, who's like kind of a fun character in how simple and like animalistic she is. She's like, I feel great. I'm flying. None of these guys will ever catch me.
Yeah, it's like a game. And yeah, she's like looking back at them and she's like, ugh, that guy, no. But maybe those two. Like she's choosing them. So it's not just who can catch her. She's like actively also deciding who she wants to maul.
To some degree. It is like, and then she kind of wants to fuck with them and then trips up, and then Nemeth is like, hello, ladies, and like kind of grabs her, and then they start some animal husbandry, some dragon husbandry.
Yeah, which we cut away from. We don't see that on the page, thankfully. After Menmeth wraps his wings around her, it cuts back to the two riders of those dragons.
So Lessa is like consumed with lust, and also maybe Falar is consumed with lust. We're less sure about him. And then they just like go at it. Maybe on the platform, it is unclear.
Well, it does say that when she kind of comes back into her body, she's looking up at the ceiling of her chambers.
Yes.
Which, how did they get up there? Because they were in the feeding ground a second ago.
They start making out in the feeding ground, so who knows?
It's just, like, did Fëanor fly them up there?
It truly confusing.
But they have sex, and you're kind of unsure that they're having sex at first because it seems like Lessa is unsure what's happening, but she describes, like, looking up, seeing the ceiling of her chamber, seeing Falar on top of her, and him not having any clothes on, and then he kisses her very aggressively, and the scene ends. It's quite there is a lot of dubious consent here because it seems like she was not in charge of her, faculties. She wasn't able to really make a decision. And at this point, we think, oh, Falar probably also was overcome. And, that's still a question of dubious consent, even if both parties are not able to really make a decision about whether or not they consent to having this relation. But we do get a little bit of clarity later, which makes this scene quite problematic. And we'll talk about that when we get to it. So the day after this happens, all of the lords are spotted outside of the weir with their armies of men because they're mad that their food supplies have been consistently raided by these dragons. So all of the dragon riders then meet, and this is the moment where Falar really has to cement himself as weir leader because it is his chance to really take control since his dragon did mate with Ramoth. But otherwise, if he's still meek around Ragul, then, Ragul will know that he still has a foothold. So Falar really has to show that he is in charge. And they meet and they discuss what to do. And Lessa is really annoying in this scene. I don't know if you remember what she does, but there's this moment where Falar is like, all right, I have a plan. And Lessa is kind of just like, oh, I know exactly what you're going to do. And the other riders don't know. And specifically this one rider is like, well, what are we going to do? And she's like, oh, you don't know? And she's kind of making fun of him for not being able to guess what Falar, like the tactical plan that Falar has for dealing with this potential conflict. And it goes on and on and on. Like, it's like a page of her being like, oh, you don't know? And Falar's like, oh, Lessa's needling people again. And it just makes the scene last forever. And this is something that happens a lot in this book with different people. It would be different if it was just Lessa who did this, because it would be a character trait of her that was like a problematic character trait that shows her as a flawed individual. But it's different people that do this, and I think it's an attempt to build tension and suspense within the scene. But because this always is happening in council meeting scenes, which are already boring, it just promotes you just want to skim. You want to just start skimming because there's no character development, there's no plot development, there's nothing important that happens in all of that space that's taken up by her being like, oh, are you sure you don't know? It's very quite simple, blah, 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 without actually saying any information until you actually finally get the information. And I think in this moment, it was trying to prove how smart Lessa is, but all it does is prove that she's kind of a jerk.
Oh, yeah. She's totally a jerk, which is maybe one of the things that I like about her. There's a lot of things I don't like about her, but just the fact that she's kind of a dick is, I don't know, I like it, personally.
Yeah, in a lot of places, but in this, it was just, can we get to the action instead of hanging out in this council room? Time is of the essence. They're coming towards your weir. Don't you want to get the plan in action? And I think also this scene was supposed to show how in sync she and Falar are on like a mental level. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's very annoying. But basically, what Falar decides to do is, because all of the holds are now undefended because the hold leaders brought their entire army, all of them brought all of their armies to attack this weir. He sends a contingent of dragons in between, led by Fëanor, to take all of their women hostage, like all of the wives hostage. And he also sends another contingent of dragons to go between so that they appear behind the armies, which is really a cool concept because I didn't know until this point that dragons could go between and then to the ground. I thought they only could go between in the sky. So the dragons kind of seem like they're appearing from nowhere when they do appear. They're just like coming up from the ground, which is like a beautiful visual. Why didn't we just go to that instead of talking about it in this council scene that lasts forever?
I mean, The next scene includes one of my favorite scenes of the entire book, which is now that they got the women, they go to confront the lords outside, and the lords are like, "We're not gonna let you do it anymore. We're gonna fight back.
Yeah.
We're like big, strong," and they come off as doofuses. But then,
Yeah. The next scene is within. It's from the point of view of one of the lords, and it's kind of this idiotic. It's so idiotically the way that the lord is thinking is almost it's comedic how idiotic and hateful he is of these dragons, and he's like, "It's time to show these dragons who's in charge." Yeah. But do you want to describe this since it's your favorite?
not my favorite, but yeah. So the lords show up, and they're like, "We're not gonna put up with this anymore. We're gonna fight you. We got a bunch of dudes, and all you have is dragons." And then the dragons show up, and all of the horses, or I think they're horses that they're riding on, are
Yeah,
like,
I think they are
"Oh,
horses.
fuck, that's a dragon."
Yeah.
And they're like, "Oh, we should have thought that horses would be afraid of dragons," which is like, okay.
Yeah, I think
Um,
the lord also is like, "I forgot how big dragons are.
it's a
I
very
thought they were
funny
small."
scene where it's just
Yeah.
like immediately miscount, like, "Oops," and then
They still do try to give their demands. And then Falar calls Fëanor in where he brings in the hostages, which are the women that they took from all of the holds, and the hold leaders give in to continuing to bring them their tithes, the proper tithes this time. So the conflict is resolved really quickly, but you do get this idea that these dragons are all flying around them. They're filling the sky. This overwhelming feeling of how big they are and that they can just appear instantly anywhere. So you feel the majesty of these dragons that probably all of these hold leaders kind of forgot about because there are so few dragons left.
it also is like the first time that the reader has, like, you've seen these dragons and they're around, but you get the full scale of the wire, and like everyone
Mhm.
flying around, and it's like a really cool, great scene. And Les is there, and she's having a lot of fun too. So it's just like a
Yeah.
really cool scene where like they introduce this villain character and then immediately defeat him, and it's like very satisfying in a way.
Yeah, so Lessa, when Fëanor is leaving to go get the hostages, she kind of begs him, like, "Please let me go with you. I want to do it." But she's never jumped between before. So he's like, "No, you need to stay here. You need to protect Ramoth. She's pregnant." And Lessa's like, "No, I still want to be a part of it." So Falar kind of gets mad because after they've kind of resolved this conflict, everyone sees her and Ramoth flying in the distance. And she's described as like this beautiful gold dragon flying, and there's a lot of awe surrounding the description of her. But Falar is still so annoyed that she did that. And it kind of feels in a way that he is mad that she kind of usurped his moment, like his dramatic moment that he had this control, and then she's just like in the background having a great time because she wants to see what's going on. So he like yells at her, and she said she was trying to prove that queens can fly, and he shakes her, which is a thing that he does constantly.
So
He's
often.
constantly shaking her. Whenever he's mad at her, he shakes her and shakes her to the point where she actually mentions it to someone else later that
At
if
the end of the
that
book, he's like, "He's gonna shake me. He's gonna shake me."
yeah, it's just terrible how much he shakes her. And he's like, "Of course queens can fly. That's why they have wings," which is so annoying. There's a time skip. So we do get a small interlude scene while we're experiencing this huge time jump where Ragul is still like annoyed that now Falar is in charge, and he's still skeptical about the Red Star really being a threat and the threads really being a threat. Because we learned that the threads have actually not appeared in 400 years, which is one of the longest intervals that they've ever had between threads. So he secretly decides to wait for his moment to usurp Falar, which never actually comes to fruition. I don't know if this happens in a different book, but we kind of don't see Ragul again after this. He's kind of just there. Falar starts to recruit young riders from the outer holds, who will then bond with the eggs that Ramoth is going to lay. And they purposefully choose riders that aren't of the quote unquote blood that Lessa is part of, because they're trying to see if their bonds can be as strong. After this, Pilar teaches Lessa to go between. And this is where his really problematic feelings come up. We have this scene in his perspective where We learn that he and Lessa have been sleeping together for the past few months, but it seems like her heart isn't really in it. And we also learn that when he and Lessa slept together when their dragons were mating, it was Lessa's first time, which Falar doesn't love.
It's worth reading because it's
Yeah. Would you like to read it?
sure. Save it because I was just like,
Yeah.
holy shit. He caught her arm and felt her body tense. He set his teeth, wishing as he had 100 times since Ramoth's rose in her first mating flight that Lessa had not been virgin too. He had not thought to control his dragon-incited emotions, and Lessa's first sexual experience had been violent. It had surprised him to be first, considering that it had surprised him to be first, considering her adolescent years had been spent drudging lascivious wanderers and
Lascivious.
soldier types. Evidently, no one had bothered to penetrate the curtain of rags and coat of filth she had carefully maintained as a disguise. He had been a considerate and gentle bedmate ever since, but unless Ramoth and
Menmeth? I don't know how to pronounce it.
were involved, he might as well call it rape. Like,
He then goes on to say that he's like has a lot of pride in his prowess as a sexual partner, but he doesn't feel like she's really enjoying it. And he, instead of like talking to her about it, he's just like sulky about it, which is even
yeah,
worse.
he's just like, oh, I'm so mad that the girl that is sleeping with me because our dragons are married isn't super into it, even though I'm great at sex. I'm like, I can't believe that nobody raped this girl before our first sexual encounter to make it go down easier. It's just like,
Yeah.
what the fuck? It's like the worst thing I've ever heard.
Yeah, it's obvious that Falar, and by extension, perhaps Anne McCaffrey, doesn't understand what the definition of rape is. The roughness of a sexual experience is not what makes it or doesn't make it rape. There can be consensual rough sex. And there can be rape that is what we might call gentle, which seems like a contradiction in terms, but the only thing that makes rape is the lack of consent. If you are not able, or if you do not give consent to a sexual encounter, or you revoke that consent during a sexual encounter, it is rape. That is the only metric by which we judge rape. It has nothing to do with how rough or gentle it is. So what he's saying doesn't make any sense. It also is so problematic that he's like, well, too bad she wasn't raped before, which would have meant that it would have been okay for me to have rough sex with her. That makes absolutely no sense. It is so disgusting to me that this would even have been written down ever, anywhere, that it just made me instantly hate him forever. Ugh, what an awful human.
Also, this is the part I've Googled two things while I was reading this book, and one of them is like, when did they outlaw marital rape? And it was after this book came out. So it's just like, oh yeah, like of course it makes sense that she's just like, they're kind of married, so she kind of has to sleep with him, and that's just sort of what they're doing. It's like the rest of the book is them moving closer together and eventually falling in love. But, like, these scenes are just so rough where he's
Yeah.
like, "Oh, my sexual partner doesn't actually like me, and she seems to like my brother better, and I'm just so sad about it, but I'm not gonna, like, talk to her about
Talk
it
to
at
her
all."
about it. Yeah, he's also jealous of the relationship she has with her own dragon, like the closeness that she, like the love and the care she gives to her own dragon. He's jealous of the relationship she has with his dragon. The other thing that makes this scene kind of problematic and makes the previous scene where they did have sex on page problematic is that in that scene where they're both overcome by their dragon's emotions, you think, oh, they're both just so overcome that they can't help themselves, which has similar consent implications. But if they're both having this, dragon-induced experience, it becomes kind of this interesting conversation about like, well, where do you and your dragon begin? Like, where do those emotions stop? But because he seemed to have and we get this from this scene in his perspective, and we do not ever get Les's perspective on this, at least not in this book, it does seem like he had some control in that situation, and he was able to make conscious choices where she was absolutely not. And Lessa never reflects on this, so we can't really get her opinion on it either way. That scene did not have to be in this book at all. But it is. And it would have been a more interesting investigation into the bonds with the dragons if they both were really trying to understand where their feelings began and where their dragons ended. But it doesn't, again, it is not that way. That is absolutely not the case. In this scenario, Fular definitely was making conscious decisions during that interaction where Lessa was not. Which, Fular, just to clear this up for you, it was rape. There you go.
It's in like a book that had it's so clear that like in the beginning that Fax is like abusing the women in his power, and like there is some sort of coercement and sexual assault happening there. It's just pretty pervasive in the first half of the book, and it doesn't need to be there.
Yeah, so when he's teaching her to go in between, he's thinking about all of this, and he just really doesn't understand where they really stand as a couple versus just, partners who are sleeping together. Something else that kind of comes up is that Lessa can speak mentally to every single dragon, but no one else can do that except for one other rider. So she talks to Menmeth a lot, and Menmeth is like also keeping this a secret from Fular. And when we get Menmeth's perspective on it, he seems like it's this funny little like prank that he's playing on Fular. But when we get Lessa's perspective on it, Lessa seems genuinely afraid of Fular's reaction when he eventually will find out. Which is really odd and kind of concerning how fearful she is of his reaction, especially since he actively shakes her all the time when he's mad at her. It's just a very toxic relationship, even though the author is trying to portray it as this really loving relationship that's just complicated in its beginnings. So it's very frustrating. But anyway, he teaches Lessa to go between, and Lessa really wants to see Ruatha. So she gives Remoth, the way they go between is they give a mental image of the place they want to go to the dragon. And she gives Remoth this image of the way she remembers Ruatha when she was a child before it went to hell. And so Remoth takes her there, and they are watching. They are in Ruatha, and she realizes that Ruatha is being attacked. She's watching these men climb up the walls of the hold. And then she realizes, because she sees herself as a child run into the Watchweir's den, she realizes that she's gone 10 years in the past. So she sends Remoth another message with a different image of Ruatha with the fire pits closed. And Remoth takes her to a different version of Ruatha, which she realizes is the morning of the first chapter of the book, where Lessa wakes up with that premonition. So she finally returns to the present to Fular, and she tells him what's going on. And she realizes that she has traveled back in time as well as space. And the reason why she had those feelings of premonitions at both of those periods in her life is because she felt her own presence. Fular then tries to do it, and he is also able to travel in time. So they realize that this is a possibility that no one has known about previously. So time moves forward again. They're doing more research, and Remoth lays her eggs. Congratulations, Remoth. And one is a queen egg. Now, this is another moment where Fular breaks with tradition. So he shows the eggs to the candidates first, so they can kind of start those bonds while the dragons are still incubating. And they decide to try to bond the queen egg to a woman named Kylara. Kylara was one of the women who was first chosen as one of the options for Remoth. Obviously, she wasn't chosen by Remoth. And they decide that she would be a good choice as another Weir woman if they were to restart another dragon Weir. Because as I think I said earlier, Bendon Weir is the only one that's still extant. The other Weirs have all been abandoned, and they don't know where the dragons. Do you want to talk about Kylara?
Oh, Kylara. I said I Googled two things while reading the book. First one was when marital rape laws are passed. The second one was the Madonna whore complex, because boy howdy is that the difference between Lessa and Kylara. When we're like, oh, Kalara's been here the whole time, and she's been sleeping her way through the Wyron.
Including Fular, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
She slept with Fular as well.
Yeah. But just like one time, so like when she has a kid, it's like probably not his.
And Fular's like, ugh, Les is so mad about this.
Oh, he loves it.
Yeah, he does.
It's gross. So we're introduced to Kalara, and they're like, "Ah, like we'll like introduce her to," because she is strong-willed, and they're showing her around, and Lessa does not like her because she still kind of got eyes for Falar,
Yeah.
which makes sense because Falar is like the smartest, hottest, strongest guy in the world.
He has those special eyes.
I
His eyes are
know.
like amber golden, even though he has black hair.
Hmm.
Fëanor does not have special eyes. Also, Fëanor never sleeps with Kylara. Fëanor's not interested. He's like the only guy who she can't get to sleep with her, it seems like. Like that's mentioned multiple times.
Yeah, I am a little bit curious if Fëanor is like maybe future gonna be portrayed as queer, or if it's just
Yeah.
that he's like such the desexualized best friend character that he's
Yeah.
like, ugh, that girl, I only like good girl, or just like,
Yeah. He's such a good boy. Fëanor is such a good boy, does what he's told without question. He takes his orders. That it would be counter to his character to sleep with Kylara. Though I would love it if Fëanor did turn out to be queer. That would be amazing. But again, I don't think that this author knew what queerness was.
yeah, I mean, and maybe there's queer characters in the later books, and that
Maybe.
would be great. But we didn't read them. We read the first one, and there are not anyone in here.
No.
So yeah, so that's Kalara.
Yeah, Kylara, the thing that makes this really not make sense, why she's so villainized for her sexuality, is that there seems to be absolutely no monogamy in this society. The character, even the Dragon Riders' names are intentionally a mix of both of their parents' names. So Falar's name, the F comes from his father, and the Lar comes from a syllable in his mother's name. Fëanor's name is the same. The F comes from his father, the Nor comes from the middle initial or the middle syllable in Minora's name. So even the naming system tends towards this idea that you know who their parents are just from their name to avoid any kind of issues with like inbreeding. And so we know exactly where their family line is. But they're not considered bastards. They're just considered half brothers. Again, there's absolutely no implication of that monogamy is the best, especially with the way that the Weir leader and Weir woman are described, where that can rotate. In 6 months, it can rotate, where that Weir leader is different and seems to always have a sexual relationship with the Weir woman.
And there's no formal marriage.
Right.
And no one, I believe, is married.
No. At least we don't meet any characters that we know of who are married, who are living in the Weir. So it doesn't really make sense why Kylara is so villainized for this reason when we know that Falar himself has sex casually with multiple women. It's just very odd. And it shows that the author is being really influenced by the society she is living in or was living in rather than understanding that this world is a fantasy world and would function differently. Anyway, so Kylara becomes the bonded person to this queen egg. The other dragons hatch. Yay. And then the threads hit for the first time. They hit over this tropical forest region. And the reason they kind of find out is just because Fëanor walks in after one of his patrols and he's covered with this gray dust.
I do have to say, blessedly, you were cutting out a bunch of like, I don't know if the threads will come. The threads will come. Like, but what if they don't? I'm like, I don't know. Like, there's so much of that,
So much
and
of
it's
that.
not important, but it's there.
The threads come, as we all knew they would, and they realize that they aren't going to have time to stop the threads before they reach the forest. Conveniently, they found out a way to beat that. So Valar sends a contingent of dragons and riders back in time to the morning when those threads are coming so that they can meet the threads in the air and destroy them before they settle on all of this lush vegetation. And I do have the description of the threads somewhere.
I do have to say, this is when it becomes a time travel.
Yeah, this is where it becomes sci-fi. Okay, so we have our first description of the threads when Falar travels between and back in time to meet. So, slanting across the sea, like an ever-thickening mist, threads were falling, silent, beautiful, treacherous. Silvery gray were those space-traversing spores, spinning from hard frozen ovals into coarse filaments as they penetrated the warm atmospheric envelope of Pern. Less than mindless, they had ejected from their barren planet toward Pern, a hideous rain that sought organic matter to nourish it into growth. One thread sinking into fertile soil would burrow deep, propagating thousands in the warm earth, rendering it to a black dusted wasteland. The southern continent of Pern had already been sucked dry. The true parasites of Pern were the threads. So we also learn in this scene how the dragons destroy the threads. So what they do is they all fly into where the threads are, and they take bags of what's called dragonstone with them. The dragons then munch on the stone, swallow it, metabolize it, and by doing this, they're able to produce a phosphine fire, and that breathing that fire destroys the threads.
It is interesting that they can't breathe fire on their own. There's like a whole mechanism
Yeah.
for it, and like an outside thing that they have to chew on, and they can't breathe fire.
Yeah, and also when the threads touch your skin, it burns it. It seems like it's either very caustic or just really very hot that it just immediately burns your skin. So when the threads touch the dragons will jump between again because it's so cold there that it destroys the threads. And what we learn is that threads are more dangerous in the summer than in the winter because cold weather kills the threads too, but in the summer they're able to come down. Which is quite interesting, the way that the dragons are able to use this really special ability of jumping between that has already been established to also fight the threads when they touch their bodies. So that was quite an interesting scene. They're able to dispel most of the threads. They acknowledge that probably they didn't catch all of them, but they return. Some have to immediately leave to fight different threads, but they also know that the threads come in regular intervals so they can predict when the next group is going to fall. Many of them are injured. They're badly burned. They're also running low on dragonstone. So this is when we first see what happens when a rider dies. An older rider is sent to get more dragonstone, but he returns covered in burns, and he does die. And his dragon lets out this haunting, keening noise and then jumps between. And all of the other dragons are really moved by this because, again, those dragons all do have this mental bond, so they can share thoughts with each other. And it is this really beautiful scene where we understand that that bond is so great that the dragon would not be able to continue after their rider passes away. They don't just die, they go between forever. And no one knows what happens to them or where they go, which is like a lovely piece of lore that I wish was explored more, but it isn't. Lessa also decides in this moment that she's really loyal to Falar. She trusts him and she's going to be faithful to him. I think because she's afraid he's going to die. And that's the end of that scene. We get another kind of jump in focus where Lessa and Falar decide to send Kylara and a bunch of young riders back in time to the southern continent, which has been destroyed by the threads, so that they can repopulate before the threads come. So their plan is we're going to send them back in time 10 years. So they're going to have 10 years to reproduce and make as many dragons as they can. And then they're all going to come back in time for the threads.
Yeah, so based on the input they get from the first day, they're like, we don't have enough dragons to do all of this. They're like, I know what we can do. We can send people back in time, and then that they'll have time to repopulate. Like I said, it's a lot of dragon husbandry in this book.
Yeah.
And that way we'll have enough dragons so that we can be able to handle this. And then one of, I think, the unintentionally funniest scenes in the entire book happens, which is a sunburnt Fëanor.
He's glowing. It's how much sun he's gotten.
Really? Because
oh, sorry, the second time he comes back, he's
The first time he shows up, he's got a suntan and he's lost a wound he got earlier in the day. So we're like, oh, it's future Fëanor from the idea we just had 5 seconds ago. And he stumbles in and he's like, everything is bad. We're so sick when we're living within a time where we exist. And Kylara has turned evil and is obsessed with herself.
Yeah.
And then stumbles out and it's so dramatic and scary. And then Lessa and Falar's, well, we've got to go send Fëanor to his doom, I guess, because he just showed up. And it's just what?
Yeah, they're like, we know that we did it now, so we have to do it.
And we can't tell anyone about it because I don't want them to know how miserable they'll be. And it's just such a weird.
Yeah, and from that point on, there's no Oh, I hope, like, I feel bad about having to make this decision. This was a hard decision. It's just this like, oh no, we had to do it. There was just no option. But also he talks about how Kylara is evil because she's not affected by that like feeling of oddness that you get when living in the same timeline that you already exist in.
She's obsessed with looking at herself.
She likes to go back and watch herself do things. But you would think that this would be a good thing. You would think that they would be like, "Oh, she's not affected by it. This could be a huge benefit to us because she can travel in time and look at things and take mental images without being affected, that then she could translate back through the dragons and then we could travel in time more accurately." But no, it's just to show how self-absorbed she is because she's not like Lessa.
This bitch is obsessed with herself is like the theme of it. And it's just like,
Yeah.
ugh. So they
Yeah.
do it anyway, and then the
Mhm.
next scene is them planning it, Lessa joking with Fëanor, and I'm just like, I don't know.
She's
This was there's been a lot of times after he's like, "Oh, I wish she had been raped. So when I had dubiously consensual sex with her, it would have gone easier." It was just like they were just joking with Fëanor, and I'm like, "You just saw him miserable stumbling in and you're just like,
yeah.
"Anyway, off to your doom."
Yeah, and they find but what they find, so Fëanor and, Lessa go down to the Southlands while Flar meets with a bunch of, like, the guild masters to see what it's like down there, and it's beautiful. It's fully regrown. It's like a nature preserve. They pick fruit from the tree, and it's so juicy that it dribbles down their chins when they take a bite from it. So Fëanor is really excited by this, and Kylara and Lessa is vibing, and she's like totally not conflicted by this fact that he was miserable back in time. So while they're doing this, Valar is again meeting with the guild masters, and we get another scene where we have this character who's just delaying information for the sake of suspense. They're talking about how to build mechanical resources. Basically, they're trying to figure out how to build a flamethrower so that they can kill the threads that way that take root in the soil. And there's this tapestry that used to hang in Ruatha, and the master weaver, is describing this tapestry, but he takes forever to get to the flamethrower part. He's talking about like how we don't know how the dyes were made and he's just like a page of him just hemming and hawing and like overly describing really irrelevant information, which feels like what this book is, honestly.
It didn't bother me quite as much, but there is just a lot of prattle in this book
Yeah.
that didn't need to be there.
Yeah, this book could have been really short. While Falar is in this meeting, Fëanor appears again, and he's glowing, he's sun-kissed. He says how great of an idea it is that they've already birthed 32 dragons, and many of them are bronzes. Falar's like, okay, I'll send back 32 children, and does so.
It's so funny because it's just Fëanor's like, "Oh, now that I'm not here, I'm actually doing great." And it's
Yeah,
we're doing fine. Like, Kalara's still evil, but like, whatever. Good idea, bro. It's just like such a weird. There's a lot of tonal changes in this
yeah.
book, and
So,
this is like one of them.
yeah, and then immediately after Fëanor and Lessa return, Falar has already gotten all the provisions together, and he's like, "Okay, you can go back now." And Fëanor's like, "But we didn't even tell you what we saw." And Falar was like, "Oh, you didn't need to." And then he sends them all back. So they all go back. They start to try to develop this flamethrower. The master, like Smith, develops this flamethrower that like is a fertilizer thrower that just throws such a high concentration of fertilizer, so I guess like a very high concentration of ammonia that it can burn the threads away, but it just doesn't is not as effective as a flamethrower. But they do remember this tapestry. During the meeting with the Weirs, Lessa also suggests that they get the past Weirs to come to the future to help, the ones that disappeared. And she is convinced that this is where they disappeared to. They disappeared to some future date that they haven't gotten to yet. And that's why they don't know where they went, because they wouldn't have been able to say, like, don't worry, you like we'll be here in the future, because that would mess up the timeline, right? She also passes out after she returns from the past because it's like a really hard on your system.
I do have to say they introduce a character in the scene who I think is actually like really important in later books based on what I heard. He's like a storyteller, I guess a song person who like memorizes songs and oral histories, and then Master Harper is what his name is, right? So he like scolds everyone for a page,
Mhm.
which is unnecessary, but then he's like, "Oh, there's this like question song that talks about all the dragons that we don't understand." And the first terms are like go away, go ahead, and then Les is like ahead. They went to the future. That's where they all disappeared. Because you find out that the reason that there aren't as many dragons is because like most of the dragons just vanished mysteriously 400 years ago, and nobody knows why. And Les is like, I know why. They came to the future, and I'm gonna go get them.
Fular shakes her and tells her that she absolutely must not try that because she already passed out from going 10 years back, so going 400 years back is going to kill her.
And of course, she listens to him, and that's where the book ends. What?
Yeah.
No? That's not how the book ends?
Lighthall, who Lessa hates, brings the tapestry, and they are able to see how to actually make a flamethrower from it. And Lessa's obsessed with this tapestry. She insists on flying it so that she can see it hung in Ruatha herself. She stares at it for a while after it's been hung up, and then she does what Lessa does. She travels 400 years into the past.
The tapestry is a picture of the hold from 400 years ago. So she's like, if I use the image in this tapestry, then I can just travel back in time.
Yeah.
And it works. She does. Yeah.
She gets there. She does. She was like bedridden for a long time.
It implied months that she's out of it, and then like pops awake and she's like, oh, I'm back. And they're like, oh, I'm saying you died.
Ramoth also is described as being like a very pale yellow instead of her usual golden when they appear 400 years in the past.
I do actually want to say that we should take a step back, and we talked about the between scenes before, and this is like, there's a really beautiful between scene where they travel 400 years back, where like Lessa, they really do describe it as a complete and utter void where she can't hear, she can't see, she can't feel.
Yeah, she can't even feel. The thing that disturbs her the most is not that she can't feel her hands, but that she can't feel that Ramoth is beneath her. And Ramoth is like trying to say, no, I'm here with you. But she is panicking so much from not being able to feel Ramoth that she's starting to like lose it.
And like they do like hold on to each other, and you realize like their relationship is one of the most beautiful and powerful in the book. Together they help each other through doing this incredible feat of traveling back 400 years.
Yeah, that is a really powerful scene. Any scene with just Lessa and Ramoth is like really sweet and wonderful, just like any scene with like Menmeth and Fular is really sweet, even though I don't like Fular. So Lessa goes back in time and she meets with the past Weirs. And pretty much instantly, I mean, like it says, they're like montages where they are like debating, but pretty instantly they're like, yeah, we're so bored now that the threads have gone that we would love to fight some threads some more. So they talk to the Master Harper of the time period and tell him that he has to compose a song that is so weird and discordant that it will be remembered, which is what that question song is. And then they decide to go forward in time, all of them, like hundreds of thousands of dragons, right? It's like 18,000 dragons.
1800 is what they said. Yeah,
No,
they're like, we've
1800.
been fighting all of our life. All we've known is fighting. So let's get some more fighting in.
Yeah. And like a whole like contingent of queen dragons too. They have like hundreds of queen dragons. They just have like a lot, they're like a surplus of dragons. And they decide that jumping the full 400 years is too risky. So what they do is they jump in 10 to like 11-year increments. And the way that they're able to track to like get that visual image in their head is actually kind of cute because they know that they can plot the course of the red star across the sky. So they know exactly what position it will be in the year that they're going to. So they plot that, fix that image in their mind, and then jump to that point based on where the red star is, which is cute and inventive. And I really enjoyed that was like a little detail that was included.
It reminded me a lot of, if you like science fiction scenes of people getting together to do some science and like figure out a big problem together, these are really good scenes. So they're like, all right, we know based on this that we can do this, so we all have to get together. And they do show you some of the like pauses and the breaks, so you get to feel the journey of jumping every 20 years.
Yeah.
It's pretty great. And then
Yeah.
the last jump is like Lessa's hits a time where she was again. They go back to, I believe, the attack on her ancestral hold, the one that like killed all of her family, and she
Mhm.
gets all discombobulated. So when they jump back to like present day, they miss it by like 2 days. It's an unnecessarily
It's so
funny scene.
unnecessary. Yeah.
I kinda love it though.
Yeah, and, like, Lytol comes out of the hold, and he's like, "Don't worry, Lessa," because she's like, "Where's everybody?" And he's like, "Don't worry, just jump back 2 days." And she's like, "What?" And she's, like, really confused, and he's like, "Don't worry, jump back 2 days, you'll be in
Yeah,
the
she's
right
like,
place."
"Pilar's gonna shake me."
He doesn't, though. Yeah, so they go back in time 2 days, and that's when and Pilar's freaking out this whole time because she hasn't returned, and he's like, "She should have just returned in an instant if she went back in time, because she went back in time, she can come back to the point where she left."
He's, like, convinced she's dead and is, like, actually heartbroken about it, truly, truly
Yeah.
heartbroken, and you're like, "Oh, he does love her. That's nice."
Yeah. But, like, when all of these dragons appear right at the front of the hold of Ruatha, he's, like, standing there freaking out to Lytol,
Uh-huh.
and then all these dragons just appear, and Ramoth it's very cute because Ramoth is like, "Ooh, Genmeth," and they, like, twin their necks together because they missed each other. It was very cute.
They're the cutest couple because
Yeah.
Ramoth will be, like, kind of a jerk or whatever, and Nemeth will be like, "I love my wife.
My dragon wife.
I love my
Um,
dragon wife. Whatever she does is good by me."
yeah, and so we find out that the flamethrowers were actually used by the Queen's Wing because the Dragonstone is kind of a form of dragon birth control. The queens can't chew it because then they wouldn't be able to lay eggs. So the queens did used to fly, but they used their flamethrowers, which the technology for was lost in that 400-year period. So Lessa is able to join the Queen's Wing, and she's able to wield a flamethrower, which is such a Lessa thing. I feel like that really tracks for Lessa's personality. Yeah, and then the book ends with them all riding to fight the next. Oh, also, I think Fëanor comes back and he's like, "Hey," and they're all like, "Hey, Fëanor," and they decide to like send them to a different weir.
They just keep them in the South. They're like,
Yeah.
"Hey."
Oh, yeah, they're establishing that weir in the south.
It was like, so they sent them back 10 years, but they were only there for 4 years, and then they jumped back, and they're like, "Oh, we left all of our shit there. It's probably, like, replenished, so we're just gonna go back there."
Yeah, and Lessa's really happy because that means Kylara will be like nowhere near Fular, even though they can jump between. Really not actually very far away. Anyway,
They do not address the Kalara situation at all. They're like, "Yeah, she's probably evil, but she's over there."
yeah, and also like Fëanor is like, "Hey, I'm fine now." I don't know. But anyway, the book ends with them going to fight the next threads. And Fular also, it ends with Fular thinking, if we can jump between times and we can jump between places, maybe we can jump in between to the planet and go on the offensive and fight the threads there instead of just waiting for the threads to come here. And that's how the book ends. So
If that sounded exciting, you can follow it in Dragon Quest. We didn't really like the book, so neither of us thought about continuing to read, even though I literally have a book with the trilogy all in one bound book. I was just like, that's enough for probably ever.
what what did you like, JoJo, about this book?
Like I said, there was definitely a bunch of scenes that I thought were very fun. It was very cool. I mean, I
Mhm.
like Fëanor.
Yeah, Fëanor is a good boy.
He's just like charming and trying his best.
Yeah.
I there's like a weird feminism to it where it's like, yeah, women are like powerful but also separate and different, which I didn't like. But
Yeah. I mean, I think that there might be a kind of breakdown of those gender roles in future books because we learn that the Queen's contingent is or the Queen's wing is this powerful force when fighting the threads. I have to also wonder if because all of the dragon riders except for the one who bonds the queen in this story are men. Women do not bond dragons, and it's unclear why that is other than gender roles. And I have to wonder if maybe in the past that wasn't a thing. Women were also bonding dragons as well. Um, and it just was something that was lost.
I mean, they talk a lot about eschewing tradition in the end, even though the front of
Yeah.
the book is all about tradition. It's quite possible that like later they have female dragon riders. I do think we
Yeah.
should talk about the dragons because like this
Yes.
whole series that we're doing is about the dragons, so I kind of want to do like a little bit of a deep dive into the dragons.
Sure. Where do you want to start?
Sure. I don't think we did a good job of specifying the different types of dragons because
Okay.
they are color coded for your convenience.
Yes, they are.
There's gold, and those are they kind of have like a bee-like structure to like a
Yeah.
hive-like structure to the dragons where you have one queen that mates, kind of can have other ones, but you tend to disperse them geographically.
Mhm.
And then you have one type of male dragon that can breed, and that's the bronze dragon.
Yeah.
And any of them can like breed with the queen, even though we sort of see a more monogamous version in the book, even though it's implied throughout the book that that's not necessarily how it works. And even Ramuth is like, if you can catch me, even though she's like so clearly in love with Nemeth. And then there's brown dragons, which seems like just like a step down from bronze dragons.
Yeah, so this is also so the gold dragons are the biggest, the bronze dragons are the second biggest, and we're going in a descending order of size when we're describing these.
And then you have
So
brown dragons, which, as far as I can tell, they're all male, but I know that the green and blue dragons have females in them.
yeah, it's not clear.
Yeah, and they're smaller. And we don't really see a lot of characters with blue and green dragons. They're just sort of hanging out. Like there's like I said, there's a lot of biological essentialism in the
Mhm.
dragons themselves, where you have the breeding female and then the breeding males, and then sort of like, I mean, they're given traditional male and female gender, and it is clear that some could breed even though they'd create lesser stock, but you really have sort of more like a bee sort of drone category.
Yeah, it seems they mentioned something about so the greens are seen as, like, kind of silly, the least logical, the most animalistic of all of the dragons, and they mate with each other, like, all the time, and it's the implication or they imply when they're talking about this that if greens were to mate and produce, eggs, all of those eggs would be green dragons. So I don't know if that means that blue dragons can produce blue and green dragons, and brown dragons could potentially produce brown, blue, and green dragons. I'm not sure if that's the case, but it seems as if the greens can only produce more green.
So, I mean, the dragon, do you want to talk about the dragon description? I don't have any descriptions offhand.
They don't have a ton of description other than that their eyes are faceted like a gemstone. So
They have 4 tongues. I do remember that.
they have what?
They've got like lizardy tongues.
Yeah, they have lizard tongues. They have multiple eyelids. They have like a clear eyelid.
They're covered in scales.
They do love to get their eye scale, like their eye ridges, their scales above their eyes scratched. That's a thing that they really enjoy.
That was definitely a thing at the beginning of the book that happened a lot and then didn't translate into the later half of the book,
Yeah.
which is a theme.
They seem like they have very long necks because Ramoth and Menmeth were able to twine their necks around each other, so they do have nice long necks. The dragon on the cover of my book looks like a pterodactyl with 4 arms, but I don't think that artist rendering is very accurate to how they're described in the book, but they don't have a ton of physical description. There is a moment where they're described as having pinions, which I tend to think of as feathers, and maybe I'm incorrect with thinking that pinions are feathers. But I don't think they actually do have feathers, so I don't know if that was just, like, the way that the author described it and didn't realize that that is something that refers to feathers, or if maybe I'm incorrect in thinking that those were feathers. It also talks about how the dragons are, like, preening their wings, which, like, why would you need to preen your wings if you didn't have feathers? But feathers are never, ever, ever mentioned, so other than, like, perhaps the pinions. And I do believe that when the dragons get burned, one of the wings is said to the leathery part of the wing is burned by the thread. So I do believe that the wings are, that leathery wing that we think of when we think of dragons. But they don't have a ton of description other than that they're huge.
Ramuth is the biggest of them, and her head is described as the size of an adult male, so that's some sort of sense of scale. But yeah, I mean, they're like, to be reductive, they're like dragony ass dragons, you know?
Yeah, I think they're like the classic dragon when we think of dragons.
And I definitely think that Anne Mccaffrey was because there's so little description. I mean, there's definitely description and characterization of the dragons, like shape and size, but because it is a little bit more ambiguous, I think she was trying to sort of work on the cultural identity of a dragon.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, and the dragons do have these very animal qualities. They're not these wise ancient beasts that we're probably going to see in the other books that, I mean, I know that we're going to see that in the other books that we're reading. They, their lifespans are pretty short. They're the same as a human lifespan, which I think is also kind of a little different from a lot of the dragons that we're going to see who are very long-lived.
Yeah, shorter if you think about it, because a lot of
Yeah,
people are bonding them when they're like teen years or
yeah,
like early 20s. So
yeah, true.
yeah, it's really interesting. And the dragons like do seem to have human age because they talk about there's several dragon riders and dragons that are described as like old and they like don't make it. There's a little bit of ageism in almost anyone who dies as a dragon rider is old.
Hmm.
So it implies that like they lose virality and like the ability to catch up as
Yeah.
they age. It does mean that dragons tend to age at the same pace as their human riders.
Yeah, it is said that they can reach sexual maturity in 2 years because when Falar thinks he might die when he's going to fight the Threads, he does say to Lessa, like, make sure that the new dragons wait 2 years before they try to fly Ramon. And I think because he's worried that all the bronze dragons will be killed when fighting the Threads. And and the dragons aren't that old at that point. So that implies that they can reach sexual maturity at 2 years, which has some weird implications for the dragon rider, their children when the dragon. But let's not get into that.
If you think too hard about all of the breeding, which is such a large portion of this book, it gets gross, unfortunately. I I wrote down 2 alternate titles for this book, and, the first one is How to Breed Your Dragon, because that's just, like, what this is about, and then the second one is, like, Everything's Coming Up Falar, because the book is really just, like, Falar slowly achieving all of his goals, well, and, like, everyone eventually, like, standing up to literally applaud him and be like, "You were right the whole time, Falar."
If Falar does it, it's correct in this book.
Yeah.
Nothing Falar does is wrong. Everything he does is right. Everything he does is extremely smart and witty and talented. He's a very frustrating character for that reason. But he's very much, again, this is very much a product of its time. I never read a book that I felt so strongly was like a book from the 60s, but you could feel the 60s science fiction just like leaking out of it as you're reading it. And I don't know how to describe why that is, other than like everything we've already said about the character relationships, the way the book is paced, kind of the weird science fiction-y vibes within what is generally thought of as a fantasy. But it feels so much of a product of its time that it is kind of difficult to respond to it, so many years later, 60 years, almost 60 years later after it was written. But yeah, Falar was a really problematic character. I kind of think of him as like, he really reminded me of Han Solo in Star Wars or like Indiana Jones.
Oh, you know who he reminded me of? He reminds me of shitty Aragorn, you know? 'Cause they have
Yeah,
the same hair.
they do have the same hair. They just have they have the different, he has amber eyes and
But, like, he's, like, the one true hair and like,
yeah.
heir, and everything he does is, like and rainbows shoot out of his ass, but, like
Yeah, but okay, I don't think they're comparable because Aragorn actually deserves the things that he gets, and he's supposed to be this like stoic hero that's unsure about his ability to rule because he is Isildur's heir, and Isildur failed in the final moment, so he's carrying that with him his whole life. And it doesn't seem like Falar has any kind of feeling like that. He's like, no, it's my time. It's Falar's time.
that's why he's the shitty like, I think
Okay,
he's
yeah.
built in the version of that type of like, he's in the mold of that character, but, like,
Sure.
without any interesting characterization, you know?
Yeah. Well, that's I think he's kind of like a Han Solo or Indiana Jones type, which is like very much a character from that time period where like, look, no hate to Han Solo or Indiana Jones. You're allowed to love him. He's a fun character, but he's supposed to in both of those. He's played by the same actor, but he's kind of playing the same character in both. He's supposed to be this like rapscallion, roguish guy, where Falar really isn't portrayed that his actions make him feel that way, but then the way people respond to him make it seem like we're supposed to see him as just this really great leader.
See, he's, like, described as by the book all the time, He's
Except when he breaks the rules constantly. Like, he was secretly sending the dragons on raiding parties that whole time. He broke with tradition so that people could meet the dragon eggs before the hatching ceremony. He sent, Fëanor back in time 10 years, knowing that he would be miserable so that they could breed more dragons.
Yeah, like I said, he's like a shitty character, and I think he suffers from the inconsistencies that are inherent in the books.
Yeah, I think all of the characters would benefit from them, like, if they were to have to kind of reconcile with the flaws in their characterization, then they would be great. It would be really interesting to read about the complexity of thought there, where they're trying to, deal with where they've kind of gone away from that moral compass that they seem to stick to, but then don't in their actions. But it never is actually addressed within the characters when they do something wrong. When Lessa is extremely cruel to Lytol, it's seen as like, oh, Lessa, even when Pilar thinks about it, he's like, oh, Lessa's being Lessa. She needs to probably calm down a little bit. But that's just her. And it's like, no, like, she's being cruel to this man who, like, went through maybe the worst thing that can happen to a dragon rider, which is lose his dragon. And she's just being a jerk to him because he's taking care of her hold. And he's doing a great job. You'd think that she would grow in her understanding of him and start to really accept him because of how well he's taking care of her heritage, right? But she never does. And I don't know if that happens in a later book. Perhaps it does, but I don't care to learn. Now, that being said, there are, again, 24 books in the series, so you may have, you listeners, may have read one of the books in this series that was a later book that you really enjoyed, and maybe you're thinking, like, well, this doesn't sound like the book I remember, and maybe Anne Mccaffrey really grew as a writer as she went through that series, as she started working with her son to create these books, and it could have, been, I don't know if she worked with her daughter as well, or if her daughter just also started publishing books within the series. But I do know that she co-published with her son. And, maybe she did grow as a writer. And I hope that's the case. I have heard that people from friends of mine that they like different little trilogies within the series that focus on a different time period or focus on different characters. So perhaps, the focus on this book was just very, very different. Yeah. There were some exhausting moments.
Sure. I mean, I do think that there's maybe some interesting characterization that could happen, but what actually happened, like a lot of agencies, like I kind of like that she's a bitch. Like I don't want to hold these characters like moral standards because I don't think that's interesting in a novel.
No.
But I do think that things that like kind of bother me, which is like both Gemma and who is that dragon rider? There's like an elderly dragon rider who dies.
Remember
So
his
both
name.
Gemma and
Yeah.
this elderly dragon rider dies, and it's both implied that it is Lessa's fault. Somehow Gemma stirs up the scene that causes Gemma to go into pregnancy too early, that costs her life. And then she specifically sends this elder dragon rider out to like restock some of the people in the field, and then he like immediately dies by the threads. And both times she's, that sucked, but I've learned a valuable lesson from this. And then like that's what she takes and moves on.
Right, and she never thinks about it again. There's no kind of it doesn't even matter if what kind of thought she's thinking. Like, she could feel rage towards those moments. She could feel like, well, it had to be done. It had to be done. She just never thinks back to those moments at all. It's as if they never happened, and they absolutely seem to have no effect on her, good or bad.
It's just a
Yeah.
weird way of like, it's like very forced characterization. And then Falar doesn't experience any character growth at all during the entire book. He just like does what he thinks is right. And then even though it's not internally consistent because he's all about tradition, then he's all about eschewing tradition.
Right.
And it just keeps working and everything's great. And then at the end, the song guy gives a big speech to all of the lords who are like, you should be ashamed. And I was just, it's just a weird book.
Well, the other thing that I didn't really understand, I know there's this kind of determinism in the time travel where they are like, well, we did it, so we have to do it again. We can't not do it because we know we already did it. But it doesn't make sense that they went back in time to bring the Dragon Riders forward because there were 5 full years, full to the brim of dragons. They would have just kept reproducing and making more dragons in 400 years. They wouldn't have just disappeared. So they would still have had 5 full years full of dragons if they didn't go back in time. So I don't understand why that was even necessary for any reason to do.
Yeah, they created a problem for themselves
Yeah.
that they had to solve. I thought they'd fall into ruin until later in the book where they're like, yeah, they just vanished mysteriously.
It would have been different also, yeah, if they knew they fell to ruin, it was a slow decline, so then Lessa went back in time to bring them directly forward, so then they would still have 4 or 5 full years that didn't decline over time. But that didn't happen.
I was just talking about there's this weird structure of a book where they like introduce a problem and then immediately solve it. Where
Yeah,
like
that happens multiple times in the book too.
there's a lot of like Chekhov's guns where they're just like, huh, I just found this gun. I wonder if we should shoot it. And then like that's the next scene.
Yeah, and that completely ruins any build of suspense or tension because you are proven over and over again, I don't have to feel any kind of tension because this is going to be immediately resolved and the character is going to once again be proven correct because they're the smartest, bestest, most handsome, most beautiful, most talented, most tactical person that has ever existed in this world. Regardless of what decision they make, it's going to be the right one.
I do have a question for you, which
Mhm.
is how do you feel about the fact that the book didn't have a central antagonist? Because I thought it made the book very weak in the early and mid points, and then they sort of told a story in the last third that I thought was a good kind of a good story to tell without an antagonist.
I mean, the antagonist is the threads, right? But you don't feel the threat of the threads until the threads actually get there.
And even then, like the first thread that they show that's burrowing in the ground, they're like, "Oh, it's in the ground. It's the thing we've been worrying about the whole
Yeah.
time." And then they immediately deal with it.
Yeah, and the fight also, they were immediately able to they didn't I don't think they lost any dragons in that first fight with the threads. I think
Just
just
the
they
old
were
dude that Lessa got killed to learn a lesson to trust Falar.
he wasn't sent to fight in the first place anyway. Like, he was kind of out of commission before that anyway. But they didn't lose any of, the young dragons. There were no, "Oh my god, this is how dangerous this is." There was nothing like that. Again, you didn't feel that tension of the threads. It didn't feel like this mounting enemy. And something that I noticed in this book, I really feel that George R. R. Martin must have read this book in his youth and was inspired by it. Not in the case of the dragons per se. I mean, obviously, there was probably some inspiration with the dragons, but actually in the world building, this idea that there's this existential threat coming down from the north. It's going to happen in winter. They're on this planet that have these inconsistent seasons, so they can't really guess when it's going to return. And it's been so long that they think that it's never going to happen again. And it's fallen into this idea of myth. Well, maybe the threads were not actually threads. Maybe the White Walkers were not actually White Walkers. They were just a symbol of the winter, right? So you really feel that connection, right? That this maybe was where the roots of Game of Thrones, the whatever, A Song of Ice and Fire series, yeah, came from. But in his books, there is this horrifying threat of you feel the weight that everyone is feeling where Ned Stark is like, no, this is happening, and nobody believes him, and he's just screaming, I mean, he's not actually screaming, but he's like, screaming in his Ned way at the top of his lungs, and no one is listening. And you are seeing these little tiny bits through cutscenes and through the different characters that he is correct, and yet no one is listening, and this threat is creeping ever closer, ever closer, ever closer. And that buildup is so great. Even though I have huge issues with Game of Thrones, that was beautifully executed. And in this book, you just don't feel it because you don't see it until the first, breakout of the threads, and then they immediately take care of the threat. And I think it's also displayed in Nausicaa in the Valley of the Wind, that Ghibli movie, where you see one of the first scenes is them destroying the poison that are the poisonous spores that are overtaking the forest. So you see that this is something that the people who are living in this area have to maintain and stay vigilant for and are fearful of, even though they feel really protected in their valley. They think that their valley is safe. There's still like this existential threat and again, you don't feel that in this because it's so late in the book that it's brought up.
Yeah. So rapid fire, so we aren't just shitting on the book, because I do think both of us genuinely enjoyed parts of it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So cool dragons.
Great
Probably could have done
dragons.
with less breeding. I liked that
Like
less
the
over the
bond between
huh?
them. I love the bonds between the dragons. I mean, we didn't need the weird dragon sex scene, but otherwise that relationship between human and dragon was so beautifully displayed through multiple characters in the book.
Yeah, a really lovely relationship. I'm trying to think. I do think I highlighted this as I was going through. There's just some really efficient world building in it. And I mean, a lot of this is like whole cloth. This is one of the earlier dragon books. So a lot of this is coming off of her head. And there's a lot of like really specific and good world building in it where it feels like kind of a concrete place and you understand the rules and the mechanisms of it.
Well, I think what actually the reason the plot in this book feels so weird is because it's setting up the trilogy. She wasn't trying to tell a full story in this book. She was setting it up for the main conflict that probably happens in a future book. So in that sense, it makes sense that she is really focusing on the world building and trying to make this world feel rich, and it does feel really rich. We understand, yeah, we understand that social structure, even though it's kind of odd. We understand the geography of the world even, and I don't know. Yeah, we do really understand that. She takes a lot of time to world build, and that is a very successful part of this book.
She does it pretty efficiently. There's a lot of
Yeah.
times where she does it through characterization. Like, she'll
Mhm.
describe what the dragon riders are doing, and that'll both be a characterization of their, like, honor, but also
Mhm.
give, like, the lowdown. Like, in the beginning, she describes the games that the dragons
Mhm.
play, and you get a sense for, like, A, how the dragons and also, like, what they're doing in the holds, and a lot of like, I think there's a lot of really efficient and good writing in this book.
Yeah, I do too. Another mechanic that I really loved was the between, was that special power that the dragons have that I haven't really seen in a different dragon book. So I guess it's something that people aren't taking with them because I'm sure that listening to this, if you have read any other dragon book, you're like, oh, I've seen that in this dragon book and I've seen this in this other dragon book. But that's something that I personally haven't seen, or at least I don't remember seeing. And I really loved, first of all, the way that it's described, the feeling of going between, the way it involves that bond and the way it kind of tests the bond between the dragon and the rider. It's just a beautiful mechanic, and it takes like the annoying parts out of the book where you would have to then wait for them to fly someplace because then they're immediately there. So we can immediately jump into that action. We don't have to have a traveling scene, which is quite nice. And I appreciated that a lot.
This book is so economical in some of its uses and then so not economical in other. I mean,
Yeah.
I think we're going to sort of wrap this up by talking about whether or not we would recommend it or not. And I feel like my review of this is it's truly a mixed bag of a book. I think honestly the representation of gender in the book is and sexual assault is probably a no for me. I don't
Yeah.
think children should read this book. It's often pitched as a young adult novel, and
Mm,
I think you don't want people who are trying to understand gender roles in this book, cuz I don't love it. I do think that if you like I think there's a lot of stuff in this series where it can get better. There's
yeah.
a lot of really good things, and I would
Yeah.
maybe probably start with a different book in this series.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. There's richness here. There's a lot to still explore. And again, I've heard people say great things about later books in the series. And when I describe to them some of the problematic things that I found, they have been like, oh, I didn't notice that when I read the book. So perhaps some of that problematic stuff was jettisoned in future books, or maybe because it's just taking place in a different time period with different characters, that kind of stuff just isn't there. But yeah, I don't think I would recommend it either, unless, of course, you like us are trying to understand kind of the roots of the modern dragon in fiction. Because I think in that case, it was extremely, like, I could see so many places where inspiration was taken from this book when dragons are portrayed in other novels. Like, it is so obvious that, I mean, just to name one, that Aragon, it took so much from this book when he wrote Aragon, which we will also be reading at some point. Yeah, I think that I would maybe skip this one, but read a different one in the series if you are interested in this world. And that's not to say that if you read Dragonflight and you really liked it, that's great, and I'm glad that you really liked it. This is just our opinion, and if you liked it, that doesn't mean that you're wrong. That doesn't mean that you have bad taste. That just means that we have differing opinions, and that's okay. And JoJo and I tend to be a little haters when it comes to books, so we are very critical. We do tend to expect a lot from the books we read. So keep that in mind, I guess, for future books as well.
I do also think that a thing that we tend to focus on is women and gender, and
Yeah.
that may not be a thing that you're as interested in.
Mhm. Yeah, there are book series that I will not read because of the way women are portrayed. I cannot get through the Witcher series because the women are written so poorly. I read the first Game of Thrones book. I will not read any more of them because the women in that book are portrayed. I just can't stand the way that they're written. And please don't say, oh, well, that's better in future books. I can't get to those books. I can't put myself through that. So we are very much more critical than I think your average reader, specifically when it comes to gender, when it comes to the portrayal of women, and the portrayal of those interpersonal relationships and romantic relationships within books.
But that's our opinion.
That's our opinion.
That's what the podcast is about. It's just our opinion.
Well, this has been Dragonflight by Anne Mccaffrey, and this has been Canonical Nonsense with Joe and JoJo.
Listeners, did you like Dragonflight? Did you hate Dragonflight? Did you have complex feelings about Dragonflight like we did? Is there a different dragon book that you would like us to read instead? If your answer was yes to any of these questions, please let us know in the comments.
And if you enjoyed listening to this deep dive and want to hear us talk about more books, please like and subscribe.
Our next book will be A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. Please feel free to read along with us.
See you next time.
Bye!